We are getting an introduction to the Mishnah, courtesy of the Rambam, in his magisterial introduction to Mishnah. And we're going through the 6 orders of Mishnah. The 63 books of Mishnah are divided up into 6 different categories. The 6 orders of Mishnah, the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. And we're up to the 4th order of the Mishnah, which is known as Nizikin, which means damages. There are 8 books in this section. Some of the most hefty, weighty, profound, wonderful, fantastic books in all of Mishnah. And it starts off with 3 books that all have similar names: Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Basra, which means the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. These are 3 books that have similar subject matters. Some argue that's really one book divided up into 3. Others say, no, it's 3 different books. Regardless, we have the first gate, the middle gate, and the last gate. Starts off with Bava Kama, the first gate. And the subject of this book is damages. If I damage someone, I have to pay. If my property damages someone, I have to pay. If I incur damages to someone else, I have to pay. And this, the Rambam tells us, this is the first book in this series, in this order of Mishnah of damages, because the first rule, just as with medicine, is do no harm. Before you learn about anything, it's important to make sure that you're not harming and causing damage to others. So that's the concept. A person is liable for the damage that he causes and the damage that his property, that his chattel, causes. And part of that means that the person is responsible to watch over, to guard his property, to make sure that it does not cause damage to another. Now, there are different categories of damages. So suppose you have an animal. It's your animal. It's your property. It's your chattel. You're responsible for this animal. And this animal causes damage. Well, depending on the nature of the damage will determine what is the category of liability that you are obligated to pay. So, for example, an animal can cause damage because it just wants to cause damage. So the classic example of this is that the animal, your ox, gores another ox. So why does it do it? Not because it gets any pleasure necessarily, not because it eats the food. It's not incidental, it's intentional. And that's one category of damage that has all of its laws. There's a second category known as incidental damage. Your animal's walking in the street and it doesn't realize that there's something there and it tramples over it. Or it walks into someone else's property and it tramples over their precious garden and their vegetables. The animal didn't even realize it's doing damage, but it causes damage. That's another category. There's yet another category known as pleasureful damage. Your animal's hungry. It walks into the neighbor's house or into the neighbor's garden and munches on all its precious vegetables. That's a third category. An example of this would be is that your animal has this is all in the Talmud, your animal has like an itchy back. You know, sometimes your back is so itchy, you can't reach it because it's right there in the middle where you can't reach it. So what does the animal do? It goes over to the tree and it rubs its back on the tree and knocks down your precious tree. Each one of these are different categories of laws and has different laws governing how these are adjudicated. There's another type of damage known as fire. Someone lights a fire. It's my bonfire. It's in my house. It's in my backyard. I'm not lighting it in your house, but what do you know? The fire travels and it goes and engulfs someone else's property. That would be another case where you'd be responsible. Even though you did it in your house and therefore you're not liable because it's in your house, but the wind came and the wind spread the fire to the neighbor. And for that, you would be not liable. Of course, what if it's an outrageous wind? It's not a wind that you could be expected to be concerned about. Maybe that would be a different law. Again, there's many, many different permutations and circumstances and variables that go into each one of these categories of damages. There's another type of damage called a pit. meaning it's a public obstacle. I dig a hole in the public property, and someone or something falls into there and gets damaged or destroyed. I'm responsible. If there was a pit, but it's covered, I uncovered it, that would be another instance where someone will be responsible for their action that caused damage. And obviously, if a person themselves causes damage, they are responsible. This is yet another category of damages. A person who strikes his fellow must pay 5 different things: nezek, tsa'ar, ripui, sheves, and boshes, which is damage and pain and healing and unemployment and shame. Now, included in this book are the laws, or some of the laws, of robbery and theft, including the laws of kefil and dalet v'hei, which means double payment. Someone steals and they are caught. They must pay restitution. They must obviously repay what they stole and pay a penalty of a doubling of what they stole. They stole 100, they pay back 200. They stole 1,000, they pay 2,000, and so on. If someone steals an animal and slaughters it or sells it, the Torah tells us you pay 4 or 5 times. That's an additional penalty for stealing and slaughtering, or stealing and selling an animal. Now, I want to just give you a little flavor of some of the things that we do in the great yeshivos when we study this, because this is one of the books that's very commonly studied in the yeshiva, because the book of Mishnah, of course, has an accompanying book of Talmud, and it's very common for students in yeshiva to study Bava Kama. That's one of the great books of Talmud. And it's very, very common to spend at least a year on this book, just to get you a sense of how much content there is. But it's a very famous question that it's just a fun question to ponder, to get a little flavor of what these yeshiva students are doing in the yeshiva. The Talmud has a debate as to what is the logic behind me being obligated for my fire. I have a fire, it spreads, it goes to someone else's property, damages their property. I'm liable. Why am I liable? What's the logic behind it? So one opinion says that your fire, it's like your arrow. If you shoot an arrow and the arrow does damage, it does damage 100 yards away. I wasn't even there. How am I responsible? Because no, it's your action. You took the bow and you took the arrow and you shot it, and therefore it's your action, and therefore you are liable. The fire is the same thing. I start a fire, it spreads. It's like my arrow. It's like as if I did the action at a distance. That's one opinion. The second opinion argues and says that no, your fire, even though we think of a fire as like a non-tangible thing, but it's like your property. And just as you're responsible to watch your animals, they don't do damage, your fire, it's like your property. And it's like just as when your property damages, you're liable. When your fire damages, you are liable. This is a very clever question that one of the early commentators asks. According to the opinion that says that your fire is like your arrow, it's as if you're doing an action at a distance, then what if someone lights a fire and they go to sleep and the fire travels? So in the eyes of the Talmud, they're still doing an action, right? It's like their fire is still ongoing. Their action is still ongoing. They're sleeping, but it doesn't matter. Their fire is like their extension of them. Their action. They're constantly setting fire, as if they're setting a new fire continuously. They may not even be aware of it, but they're doing the action. So what if someone lights a candle and there's a fire and the fire is burning, burning, burning? So logically, you would say that it's like they're making the fire. They're continuously doing the fire. So the question is, how could you light candles on Friday afternoon before Shabbos? And of course, the candles, the Shabbos candles, the most iconic part of one of the most iconic parts of Shabbos. The candle's burning down, and it's 2-3 hours into Shabbos before it gets extinguished. So it's like you're lighting a fire on Shabbos because, according to the opinion that says that it's your continuous action, it's like your continuous action is ongoing into Shabbos. How do you violate the Shabbos by lighting the Shabbos candles? Very clever question, and lots of debate and discussion about this in the great yeshivos. But that's the first book, Bava Kama, of the Fourth Order of Mishnah, known as Nizikim, which is damages. Now, the next book is called Bava Metzia, which means the middle gate. And this is, again, similar laws. It's more interpersonal laws. It talks about laws like finding a lost object. You find a lost object, what do you do with it? It's not yours. Could you keep it? Must you keep it? Should you leave it there? Should you try to find the owner? Are you able to assume ownership because of one reason or another? What about if the court has to adjudicate between disputed ownership? Two people come in and they're clutching the same garment, and each one says it's theirs. Who owns it? What do you do? How do you process the claims and the arguments? What about if there's a custodian, a guardian? Someone is watching your item. He's the guardian. And it gets lost. Or it gets stolen. Or there was negligence. Or it broke. Different types of custodian, different types of laws. When someone agrees to watch something for free, yeah, sure, I'll watch your item while you go on vacation. And they do it for free. Well, because they do it for free, they have the least liability. So it gets lost, it gets stolen, they're not liable. They may need to administer an oath to swear they didn't pocket it, but they're not liable. Someone who gets paid to watch something, a shomer sachar, or a renter, well, they have more liability. And the most liability is the borrower. I want to borrow your lawnmower. I want to borrow your ox to help plow my field. Because I have all the benefit as the borrower, it just, the person who's giving it to me is just lending it to me for free. Therefore, the borrower has the most liability. And even if a lightning strike come and kills the animal, you would still be responsible. Even though you're not to blame, it was a total accident, nonetheless, you would be responsible. So all these laws and how claims are processed in courts, the administering of oaths, the different types of oaths, the oath of a custodian, the oath of partial admittance. This is Modeh b'mitzas. Two people come to court, Reuven and Shimon, which is always the names that they give. Two people. Bob and Joe, Reuven and Shimon. The two people come to court. And Reuven says, I lent $100 to Shimon. And Shimon says, no. I don't owe you $100. I owe you $50. So he's admitting partially. There's a claim, 100, and there's a partial admittance of 50. In that case, there's an oath on the other 50. Because the person, the litigant, is being told, is admitting to half of the claim, he's responsible to swear. He must have the oath in court on the other 50. More laws in this book, methods of acquisition, which is an idea which is found all over the Talmud. How do transactions happen? How are things conveyed from one person to another? What causes the change of ownership from one person to another person? So if I pay money, is that enough? Does a bill of sale, a document, does that work? What about an act of possession known as chazaka? To lift something, to pull it, to grasp it, and so on, to assume ownership. How does that happen? Laws of hiring laborers, laws of usury and interest, laws of sharecroppers and tenant farmers. All these fascinating laws. Again, this book of Talmud Bava Metzia, very common to spend at least a year in the academy studying it. And even then, it's very rare for someone to finish the entire thing, certainly not at a deep level. It starts off, this is a very famous Mishnah, the first Mishnah of the book. Shnayim ochazim betalas. Two people are holding onto a garment. And they arrive in the court and they're clutching the same garment. And one guy says, I found it. One guy says, no, I found it. It's mine. It's mine. One guy says, it's all mine. And the other guy says, it's all mine. What do you do? There's no documentation. There's no bill of sale. There's no receipts. There's no proof. There's no witnesses. No nothing. How does the court process this situation? So the law is, Ze Yeshava, one guy swears, an oath administered in court. He swears that he owns no less than half. And the other guy swears that he owns no less than half. Each one claims they own the whole thing, but they own, at a minimum, they own half. Ve'yachloku, and they split it. Meaning they divide it, either they sell it and they split the proceeds, one guy buys it from the other, but the point is that it's owned by them jointly. That's the first law of this book, the first Mishnah. And again, I'm not exaggerating, months and months and months on all the different permutations and all the different Talmudic debates and discussions. Absolutely fascinating. And to get you, again, a little flavor of what happens in the academy, the Tosfos commentary, which you'll find on the outer margins of every standard folio of Talmud, what the Tosfos does, he introduces different citations from the Talmud that seem to be in conflict with the citation at hand. So we have a Mishnah that says two people grasping onto a garment. Each one claims it's entirely theirs, and ultimately they split it. Each one swears they don't own less than half, and they split it. Says Tosfos, there are two very similar cases from elsewhere in the Talmud. And in those similar cases, there's a different law. There's a different ruling. There's a boat. A boat. And two people claim it's theirs. One guy says it's mine. Other guy says it's mine. It's almost identical, right? Two people grasping a garment. Each one saying it's theirs. Two people grasping a boat. Each one saying it's theirs. It seems like it's identical. And in that case, the court says, we're not getting involved. Whoever wins this, you guys tussle it out. Figure it out yourselves. Kol de olim gavar. Whoever's stronger will prevail. That's the ruling. What's the difference? Or a different case. Two people deposit money with a third party. With the third party who's the custodian. One person gives 100. The other person gives 200. And each one claims that they're the one who gave the 200. So they each agree that one person gave 100, for sure. One person gave 200, but they each at least gave 100. And the only dispute is on the last 100. So you may think, well, it's similar to the case of two people who are claiming that the garment's entirely theirs. They should split it. In that case, no. It's a different law. The custodian must give 100 to each party, and the disputed 100 he gives to no one. He keeps it. He keeps it until Elijah the prophet comes and tells him who to give it to. What's the difference? What's the logical difference between the case of two people holding one garment, where it's split, and two people claiming that they have the 100 coins, where you hold it in abeyance until Elijah comes? Three nearly identical cases, three different rulings. Okay, that's a little bit more sophisticated, a little more subtle. Welcome to Talmud. And again, as I mentioned, it's very standard to spend a year on this book of Talmud and to not finish it. I want to mention, before we move on to the third bava, the third gate, that the second chapter of this book, that is where traditionally young students, their first foray into Talmud is typically the second chapter of the book of Bava Metzia. And that chapter begins, Elu Mitzios Shelo. These are the found items that are yours to keep. And these, you must proclaim them, you must announce them, you must hang up a sign and try to find the rightful owner. And it gives a list. All the things that you find, these sorts of things found in these sorts of ways, you're allowed to keep it. These things found in these sorts of ways, you are obligated to try to find the rightful owner. That's how we start Talmud for young students. That's Bava Metzia. Let's move on to Bava Basra. The third gate, the last gate. This is the longest book of Talmud at 176 pages. You're like, oh, that's a short novel. I can read that on a cross-country flight. No, you can't. I promise you can't. You want to finish it and to understand it? At least a year? At least. Now, you'll notice if you actually open this book of Talmud, if you ever have the great privilege to hold this book of Talmud in your hand and to open it, you notice that the pages look a little bit different. Meaning that in a typical book of Talmud, you have the actual text of the Talmud in the middle, and on the inside margin, you have the commentary in Rashi in like a smaller font, and the outer margin, you have the commentary of Tosfos also in a smaller font. So there's a certain look, and every page of Talmud is oriented different because there's not the identical amount of commentary in every page. So sometimes you'll have a book of Talmud that's almost entirely the text because there's very little commentary. And sometimes you have, one or two lines of text and the whole thing is commentary. But in general, you'll find that this book has comparatively, relatively smaller texts of Talmud and larger texts of the commentaries. And the reason is because on page 28 of this book, for some reason, the commentary of Rashi ends. We don't know if he passed away then, if it was lost. Most likely it wasn't lost. For whatever reason, we don't have it. There's a few books of Talmud that the writing of Rashi just stops. There's one of them actually very famous in the book of Makros, which is also in this order. On page 19, like in the middle of a comment, it ends. And the last word of that comment is the word tahor, which means pure. And in every book of Talmud, you'll see like a parenthesis where it says, here Rashi died. Like Rashi was in the middle of commentating on this, and he passed away in the middle of a sentence. And then it says, and his soul departed with purity. Like the last word he wrote was pure. But anyhow, as a result of that, in the book of Bava Basra, you have from page 28 and onward, you have the commentary of the Rashbam, who was actually Rashi's grandson. He said, okay, Rashi stopped at page 28, I'll do the rest of it. And his commentary is a little bit more verbose than Rashi's, so you have actually more commentary of the Rashi stand-in, and therefore the books of the text of Talmud from page 28 and on are generally smaller than they are throughout the rest of the book of Talmud. Now this book of Mishnah and Talmud deals with property rights and the acquisition of property and partnerships and how they are dissolved, and responsibilities of neighbors to not damage their neighbors. You cannot use your property in a way that will infringe, encroach, or impinge upon your neighbor. But it's my property, yes. But if I, let's say, plant a tree that the roots are going to go to the neighbor's property or destabilize their home or anything like that, that would be prohibited, even though it's me acting in my own property with my own stuff. A very important theme in this book is the idea of chazaka, which we could maybe translate as assumed ownership. How long do you have to keep your bill of sale for your property? If you've been living there for 10 years, every single day, and you have evidence to prove that, and you say, I bought it, I just lost the document because I've been living here for so long, that would be very important because we assume someone's been living there for 10 years and no one ever challenged it, questioned it, no one ever raised any objections to it. That can give us the confidence that you are actually the true owner. And therefore, if you say, I bought it and I've been living here and I proved to that, I just lost the documentation, the court would say, well, how long have you been living there? You've been living there for 10 years? Okay. We now assume there's a presumed ownership because you've had unmolested years of living and using that property. The latter part of the book are the laws of inheritance, how inheritance is apportioned, and what about when there are uncertainties regarding inheritance and how those are resolved. The Rambam, when he talks about the books of Mishnah, he always talks about why they're thus organized. And he says, of the three bavas, of the three gates, this is at the end, the last of the three, because most of the laws here are not explicit in the Torah. It's based upon the tradition and, of course, logic, and therefore it's going to be placed at the end of these three books. The next book is the book of Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the term for the court. And actually, there are two types of Sanhedrins. There's a small one. Every province would have a small Sanhedrin, and that was comprised of 23 sages, 23 justices. And then there was the large Sanhedrin, which was in the marble chamber in the temple, on temple grounds. In the marble chamber, there was the Sanhedrin, the grand Sanhedrin, the great Sanhedrin, the Sanhedrin that was founded by Moshe, 70 elders plus Moshe, a total of 71 of the greatest sages were always stationed in the temple in the marble chamber. So all told, there are three different types of courts in our system of justice. For more basic laws, you have courts comprised of 3 justices. For more advanced laws or more serious laws, like capital punishment, can only be done with a court of 23 justices, meaning a small Sanhedrin. And any law or any ruling that is of national importance, that can only be done by a court of 71, by the Grand Sanhedrin stationed in Jerusalem. And the subject of the book is justice and the adjudication of justice, and justices and the appointment of justices, and in general, our jurisprudence. Starts off, the first Mishnah, all the potential different types of court cases and the types of courts that are needed for each one of these types of court cases. We have the laws of how courts are selected, meaning two people have a dispute. It's a monetary dispute. You just need 3 justices. Well, how do you decide which court to go to? That is a major subject of the book. But the primary subject of the book are how are these cases adjudicated? What does a court do? How do they examine the witnesses? The different types of cross-examination of the witnesses. What sorts of discrepancies in the 2 witnesses' testimonies that would disqualify and which won't disqualify the testimony? And of course, there are different standards of cross-examination for adjudicating capital crime cases versus civil cases. With capital crime, it's imperative to not make a miscarriage of judgment and arrive at the wrong ruling. So there's many different laws related to how capital crime cases are treated differently. So for example, when you have the discussion, so the witnesses come and the evidence is compiled and organized and examined, and the witnesses are interrogated and cross-examined, and it's time to render at least a preliminary ruling. Because the justices themselves could debate and discuss and evaluate the arguments of their peers. But when it's time to present the arguments, who do you start with? Who presents the arguments first? So, as you would imagine, for ordinary cases that don't have capital punishment, you start from the most senior. The most senior, they're the ones who go first. The most senior of the sages, of the justices, they convey their ruling, or at least their preliminary ruling, first. But what happens if there's a capital crime case? And maybe there's some sort of argument for acquittal that the most junior of the justices came up with. And if you start from the most senior and prestigious of the justices, there's a worry, there's a concern that the more junior justice will be scared or uncertain to present the argument for exculpation. And therefore, when it comes to capital crime, you start from the most junior. That way we can make sure we hear every single argument that could potentially arrive at acquittal for the accused. In a typical case, civil case, you could begin the debates and discussions by talking about the arguments for guilt or innocence. Capital crime cases always begin with arguments. What are the arguments? What are the grounds for acquittal? That's how you initiate the debate and discussion amongst the justices. With regards to seeking external arguments, an amicus brief, if you will, we seek out arguments for acquittal even from non-justices. So, for example, you always had in the court, there were apprentices, there were other scholars who weren't quite members of the court, but they were there. They were present for the discussions, for the debates, because they were being trained to become great sages themselves. So if one of the students is present at a debate, at a court case for a capital crime case, and they say, I have an argument for guilt. I have a proof that this person is actually guilty and should be executed. That student is silenced. You're not part of the court. Only members of the court can offer arguments for guilt. But if one of the students says, I have an argument for acquittal, then they say, okay, come, you're temporarily nominated. You're joining us. You're going to sit amongst us. You're going to present your argument. And even if the argument is meritless, we're not going to kick you off the court for the entire day. Meaning, we want to make sure that everyone feels comfortable to present any and every argument for acquittal. And even if the accused themselves, if they have an argument that can provide an angle of acquittal, the accused themselves can, provided there's something substantial in what they're saying, they can present an argument. Now, what if the person's guilty? They're just guilty. Even if there is a preliminary acceptance of a guilt verdict, there's always a delay. If they can't find any argument for acquittal, they say we have to think about it. And the entire night, all these sages, they stay up the whole night and they argue the case out, and they don't even eat, and they don't drink any wine, in order to just focus the entire night on any argument for acquittal. Because we're not going to execute someone in Jewish court of law until every single stone has been overturned, and every argument has been analyzed, and every prospective potential argument for acquittal has been addressed. Moreover, once there's the final vote, you actually need a supermajority for a guilty verdict and only a simple majority for an acquittal. So you have a 23-justice court. The simple majority is 12 to 11. If 12 say acquittal and 11 say guilt, he's acquitted. But you need a minimum of 13 to 10 for a guilty verdict. Now, the book deals with justices, but also deals with other people of prominence, namely kings and high priests. So all the laws of a king, all the laws of a high priest, and how they must conduct themselves in their office are in this book. And the bulk of the book, again, is the 4 different types of capital crime and capital punishment. Which capital crime carries with it which capital punishment? It's a full list of all the capital crimes and the methods, the 4 different types of capital punishment administered by Jewish courts of law. Very interesting. There is also some extrajudicial authority. In certain instances, the courts have the right to impose extrajudicial measures, including even extrajudicial capital punishment. There are certain cases where someone is executed, but not even in a court. It's extrajudiciously. One example, someone who steals a vessel from the temple. Temple's full of gold. Someone's like, oh, I'm going to grab this and put it in my pocket. That person's not brought to court. Rather, he's bludgeoned to death instantly by the priests. That's one example. You don't take anything from the temple. The laws of the wayward and rebellious and the ben sorer umora. Laws of rodef, which is someone who's a pursuer. Someone's trying to kill someone else. So you can't stop and say, oh, let's go find 23 justices. No, like he's trying to go chasing after him to go to shoot him. In that case, every bystander must save the victim, even if it means killing the perpetrator. Now, the book ends with something which is even worse than capital punishment. Capital punishment is reserved for the worst of the sinners. The absolute worst, most wicked sinners, they get capital punishment. But even worse than that is capital punishment for the soul. Is disenfranchisement for the soul. Someone who, God forbid, does a sin that carries with it the degree of severity of capital punishment, they confess, they repent before they die. and their soul is cleansed by this punishment, and their soul could live forever in eternity. But there are certain sins that are so severe that there's nothing that can be done. Their soul is punished. There's capital punishment for the soul. I want to read to you some of the iconic Mishnahs of this book, the Book of Sanhedrin. There's the exact text of the cross-examination of the witnesses. How do you intimidate witnesses? Again, capital crime cases. There's two witnesses who claim that the defendant is guilty of a capital crime. We don't take any chances with this. They bring in the witnesses and they intimidate them. And they say, are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? Did you hear it or did you see it? Did you see it exactly? Or did you just see it and you were able to interpret what happened? The Talmud gives a very dramatic case. Listen to this. Two witnesses, they see a crazed murderer with a knife chasing someone. I'm going to kill you, chases him. And they're trying to stop him, but they can't do it. They're chasing him down. And they see the victim and the murderer running into a cave. And they're able to see what happens in the cave, but the murderer comes out and he's got a bloody knife. And they walk inside the cave and they see that the victim was killed. The cave is completely hermetically sealed. We know exactly what happened over here. These witnesses cannot come to court and say, we saw this person, Reuven, kill Shimon. They didn't see it. They know that Reuven killed Shimon. They didn't see it. And therefore, that testimony is not admissible. You may actually administer in court. You could say what you heard, but this is not a case of capital crime. This may be a case of extrajudicial punishment. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But this is not testimony because you didn't witness it with your own eyes. And then the intimidation and cross-examination continues. And they tell him, if you, with your testimony, if you're going to cause someone to be executed, and it's not true, you fabricated a story, there's no way to ever gain repentance for that, atonement for that. Someone, God forbid, steals from someone else. You pay him back, okay. You make amends. God forbid, in a case of capital punishment, the blood of the innocent person who was killed, and all their would-be children, and all the would-be grandchildren forever and ever and ever, are all going to be on your hands. And it cites the example of Cain and Abel. Cain murdered not just Abel, but all the innumerable would-be descendants of Abel. The bloods, plural, of Abel are crying out to me from the ground. And then, maybe this is the most famous part of this discussion, the witnesses are told, why was Adam created alone? Why weren't there 50 different Adams, or 1,000, or 1,000,000 humans all at once created? To teach us the value of one life. If you're going to cause this Jew to be executed in the Jewish court of law, it's as if you destroyed Adam. You destroyed the entire world. And if you provide salvation for one soul, it's like you have upheld the entire world. Again, it continues, but very iconic. The idea, Mishnah continues that the person is obligated to say the world is created for me. That comes from this Mishnah. Chayev Adam Lomar. A person is obligated to say, Bishvili Nivra Haolam. The world is created for me. I'm like the Adam of my own world. What if there's a murderer who's loose, and for some reason the court just can't pin him down? We know this guy's a murderer. And we have all sorts of evidence, and we know for sure, just for some technicalities, we're never able to pin him down. It's imperative to not allow a murderer on the loose. So let's say you have two witnesses that witnessed a murder. Terrible. But they weren't exactly compatible witnesses. Maybe they didn't see it at the same time, or for one reason or another, there's some technicality that prevented them from having their testimony accepted in court. So the court would actually take action on their own to remove this menace from society. It describes they would put him into a small, constrained place. They would incarcerate him, and they would feed him a diet that would cause their death indirectly. Meaning, we this is a murderer. We know for sure, not a question, and we have to get rid of him. We have to incarcerate him so he doesn't do any more damage. But also, we want to eliminate him, but we can't. So they find an indirect way to eliminate him, because a murderer, that's the worst sin of them all, and that is not tolerable at all. Now, the last chapter, it's a very famous chapter of this book. It's called Chelek, based upon the Mishnah that says all of Israel has a Chelek, has a portion in the world to come. This is an entire chapter of Mishnah and of Talmud that deals with the philosophical ideas, the most important philosophical ideas of our religion. All of Israel has a portion of the world to come by default, but a Jew, even someone who starts off life as someone who would be eligible for eternity, they can lose it. If they reject the foundational principles of the religion, they exclude themselves from the religion, and therefore they exclude themselves from the perks of the religion, namely the eternality of their soul. So if someone says, there is no afterlife, there is no resurrection of the dead, there is no world to come, so they're in effect condemning themselves to not have that. They're actually correct. For them, there won't be a world to come. There won't be a resurrection. There won't be the eternality of their soul. If someone rejects the divinity of the Torah, if someone is an apikores is a word of Greek origin. It means a heretic. What exactly that means, the Talmud discusses. Rabbi Akiva, he talks about someone who can lose their portion of what to come if they read certain heretical and apocryphal texts. Or if someone does incantations on a wound and says a verse in scripture. Or someone, God forbid, who enunciates the ineffable name of God. We cannot pronounce that name, and according to one opinion, that sin is so severe that someone who does that would lose their portion of what to come. Now, why is Sanhedrin placed over here, the fourth book in the order of damages? Why? Because once it talks about all the laws, Bava Kama, Batzima, Basra, three Bavas, three gates, talks about the courts and how those laws are administered and adjudicated. The next book is the book of Makos. It's very much a companion work to Sanhedrin. Once the Mishnah talks about all the different laws related to capital punishment, it also talks about the laws related to corporal punishment. There are many different laws that don't carry the weight, the severity of capital punishment, but the court can do punishment in other ways, namely lashes, makos or malkos, corporal punishment, caning. This is the way things used to be done. Today in Singapore, they still do it. That's why there's no crime. In America, it's like, oh no, we can't do that. Let's put them in a box for 20 years. That's not how it's done in Singapore. They lash him and they beat him, and then they let him back home. That's the system of justice that actually is designed to rehabilitate, not to treat humans as dogs to be put in a kennel. Now, this is traditionally one of the books studied by young people. It talks about the laws of false witnesses, or the laws of going to exile for accidental murder, and laws of malchus, laws of corporal punishment, lashes, and caning. I want to read to you the last Mishnah of this book. Very interesting. Rabbi Hanania ben Akashya Omer. Rabbi Hanania, son of Akashya, says, God wanted to make good, to benefit Israel. And therefore, he gave them so much Torah and mitzvos. Why is there so many details, so many laws, so much Torah, so many mitzvos? It's for our benefit. Shenemar, Hashem chavetz matziko, God is desirous because of his righteousness. Yagdil Torah. He makes Torah big and great, v'yadir, and awesome. Very interesting Mishnah, that the voluminous nature of Torah and mitzvos, it's for our benefit. Some could argue it's the opposite, it's for our detriment, because every law carries with it the opportunity, of course, of fulfilling the law, but it also carries with it the opportunity of, God forbid, blundering in that law. So some could argue if we had just one mitzvah, maybe that would be best. Adam had one mitzvah. Very simple. There's only one way he could have blundered. Of course, he targeted that and blundered in that way. But we have so many mitzvahs. You cannot conceive of a situation in life that there wouldn't be some Torah law governing how to behave. So it's absolutely comprehensive. And why? Says Rabbi Hanani ben Akashia, it's for our benefit. It's for our benefit. And of course, the commentaries explain, well, we've talked about this in the past, this Mishnah has been addressed in the past, but let's proceed to the book of Shavuos. The Shavuos, of course, is the festival of Shavuos, which means weeks. That's not that Shavuos. Shavuos means oaths in this context. This is similar to the content of the preceding books. The court has the rights, part of the powers of the court are to compel oaths. There's all sorts of different types of oaths. There's a declarative oath. A person swears to do something or to not do something. This is similar to a vow. An oath sworn in vain, a pointless oath. That's a violation of the Torah. Absolutely prohibited, because you're swearing in the name of God, something which is in vain, something which is pointless. That is a violation, very serious one. There's the oath of testimony by a witness. There's the oath of a deposited. As you mentioned earlier, there's the oath of partial admittance of a claim. Moda b'mitzvataino. Some oaths are of biblical origin. Some oaths are of rabbinic origin. That is the book of Shavuos. And next comes a very fascinating, very different style of a book, Eduyos, which means testimonies. It's a collection of all sorts of different rulings that relate to all the different books of Mishnah that were testified by the great sages. And this book has an important historical background. At the time of the destruction of the temple, at the hands of the Romans, the sages had departed the marble chamber, and they moved to a different place. They moved actually out of Jerusalem, and they were in a place called Yavne. That's where the sages were, the Sanhedrin really, was located. And the head of the Sanhedrin was the Nasi, was the president. His name was Rabban Gamliel. And it's a long and fascinating story, but he was deposed as president, and he was replaced by Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was only 18 at the time, but with a big, impressive white beard. And he instituted several changes in the policy of the academy. And chief amongst those reforms was the policy to open the doors of the academy wide open. Whoever wants to come study can come study. It used to be only those who are righteous, who were internally righteous and externally righteous. Only those people were allowed in. Comes along the new regime of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Whoever wants to come, come. And they had to add hundreds of benches to accommodate all the new students. And this was a very important day because it really changed the tenor of the academy. And on that day, they resolved to answer all the questions that could possibly exist in all the law. And there's so many new students, and there's this influx of Torah that really made this conversation, this debate, and this discussion quite robust. And many of the testimonies that are recorded in this book, in the book of Idios, were actually delivered from the academy, that this is like a reliable source. We can trust their testimony for a given law. Again, the gamut of laws, it runs the entire gamut. All different types of laws are testified in this book. I want to mention one of them, very interesting one. One of the great sages of the time, his name was Akavia ben Mehalalel. And he's mentioned quite infrequently in the Talmud. He's mentioned, in fact, only once, besides for his very famous teaching in the book of Pirkei Avos. He's the one who says, look at three things, you'll never sin. Histakel b'shlosh advarim. And you will not sin. Know where you came from, know where you're going to, and know before whom you are destined to give an accounting and a reckoning. But he was one of the great sages of the era. And there were 4 things that he testified that the sages disagreed with. And the sages told him, if you just retract these 4 problematic opinions, you will be nominated to be the Chief Justice. That's what they told him. It's a pretty sweet offer. You can be the greatest sage of the land if you just retract, you recant these 4 opinions that are problematic. And he said, I don't want to do that. I'd rather be called an imbecile every day of my life and to not be considered for even a single second to be wicked before God. I don't want people to say that my opinions that I receive from my tradition and my sages, my predecessors, that I just discarded them because of some position. That some opinions say that the sages weren't happy with him. Some say that they disenfranchised him. And some say that he was kind of excommunicated. And some say that when he died, they threw rocks at his coffin as a way to gain atonement because of his iconoclastic beliefs. A second opinion says, no, God forbid that you would say that he was excommunicated, because if he was part of a group of Jews that comprised 1/3 of the entire nation, there was one time a year that the nation was divided up into 3. That was the day before Passover, Erev Pesach, where everyone had to bring their paschal offering to the temple. And they came in 3 shifts. So if he was part of a shift of 1/3 of the whole nation, there was no one amongst his cohort of 1/3 of the nation who equaled him, who rivaled him in wisdom and fear of sin. He was above and beyond. And the Mishnah continues what he told his son at the time of his death. He told the son, you recant these opinions. I'm not going to recant them. You recant them. Why? Because I accepted this teaching from my predecessors. And this was not a radical opinion in my day. And therefore, I have to maintain that opinion. But you only heard it from me against the preponderance of the sages. And therefore, for you have to recant it. And it continues. He wanted to get a commendation from his father. And he says, no, I'm not going to give you a leg up. I'm not going to recommend you to my colleagues. Ma'asecha yikrevucha, your own deeds will bring you close. Uma'asecha yirachakrucha, and your own deeds will push you away. I'm not going to help you. No nepotism over here. And the Rambam tells us the purpose of this book is to remember all the laws that were testified by trustworthy people and whose testimony is worthy to rely upon. 3 more books we have here in this, or several more books we have over here in this order. We have the book of Avodah Zarah. Avodah Zarah, of course, means idolatry. This is the book of idolatry. A judge has to know the laws of idolatry in order to, and the practices of idolatry in order to properly adjudicate them. Because, of course, idolatry is a capital crime, but certain types of idolatry are not actually under the rubric of a capital crime. There may be other violations, but they're not capital crime. So if you worship someone, God forbid, were to worship idol A in the manner that's not fitting for idol A, but rather for idol B, they would not be guilty of a capital crime. And why is this placed all the way at the end? Says the Rambam, it's so rare. You have to find a Jew that gets into this stuff. It's so rare. We'll put it all at the end of the order. Now, quite interestingly, in the order of Mishnah of damages, you'll find Pirkei Avos, the ethics of the fathers. Now, as you may or may not know, we studied it at the Torah Center at great length. We even have a whole podcast called the Ethics Podcast, where we finish the entire book, Mishnah by Mishnah, teaching by teaching. We have like 150 teachings, 150 episodes on this book. This is the book of Mishnah that talks about ethics and character improvement and character refinement. And it starts off, quite importantly, with the delineation of the transmission of the Torah from Moshe to Joshua, Joshua to the elders, elders to the prophets, prophets to the men of assembly, and so on. And it goes where it records the teachings of the great sages throughout the ages. Now, why is the book about character improvement, self-improvement, ethical development, ethical refinement? Why is that in the section of Mishnah that deals with damage and law and justice and jurisprudence? So the Rambam tells us, you know who needs to know how to have refined character more than anyone else? That's the judge. That's the leader. If it's a simpleton, an ignoramus, and they're not refined, so yes, it's a terrible thing. They're ruining themselves. They're harming themselves. But it doesn't spread to others. But a judge, a leader, someone people look up to, if he, God forbid, is unrefined, if he's not elevated in his character, it damages them and everyone else. And that's why the book of Pirkei Avos specifically begins with, in chapter 1, many, many lessons that relate to judges. For example, Havi Misunim Badin, the first law, be deliberate in judgment. Don't rush to render a judgment. That is because the most important, the beneficiary of this book is actually the judge who is a leader and who renders rulings, who has a very important role to play amongst the nation. They have to know these laws more than anyone else, and therefore this book is placed in this order of Mishnah. And finally, the book of Horius, a very short book. The word Horius is the plural for Hora'ah, which means a ruling. And specifically, what happens when a court makes an erroneous ruling. The court makes a blunder, and it gives a wrong ruling, and people follow that ruling. Someone doesn't know what the law is and says, I'll just follow what the Sanhedrin says, and I'll follow what the people say. And humans, of course, are fallible. What if the court or the Sanhedrin makes a mistake and people follow it? So all those laws are found in the final book of the Order of Mishnah of Damages of Nezikim, the book of Horius. Thus we conclude with this order of Mishnah. The Mishnah is divided up into 6 orders, to 6 sidarim of Mishnah, and we've now had a very cursory overview of the 4th order, the order of Nezikin. 2 more to go. Kachim, which deals with sacrifices, and Taharos, purity and impurity. Very exciting to get a little bit of an overview, very, very brief overview into this foundational work of Torah Shema Peh, of oral Torah. The Mishnah, the 60 or 63 books of Mishnah in its 6 different orders. I appreciate you listening to this. Hope you have a wonderful day. And my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. Send me an email with your questions, your comments, and your feedback.